This is Alonzo A.J. Jones, host of The Beautiful People. Dr. King wasn't a dreamer. Dr. King was a revolutionary. He did it with the love ethic foundation that he took and emulated from the Christ figure. But by no means was he sort of this romantic look in the air dream and that solves problems. Dr. King was a frontline strategist, thinker, philosopher, and moved forward with strategy, sweat, equity, blood, fear, depression, death, threat, incarceration, stabbed, all these kinds of things. I always like to say that people believe Dr. King was born full grown, and the first words out of his mouth was the 1963 I Have a Dream speech. Dr. King was in high school and skipped the 9th grade and the 12th grade. So here he is, 15 years old, finishing up in terms of traditional K-12 education. And the Morehouse College is suffering from an enrollment decline because many African Americans are going off to the war to become GI. So here Dr. King enters Morehouse at 15 years old. At this phase, he's actually not drawn to the seminary. He thinks it's too emotional. He thinks it's not something that's rooted in academia. And so he's sort of struggling. He initially wants to become a medical doctor. But quickly in his undergrad experience, he realizes that he doesn't have an apt for science. And so Dr. King ultimately graduates from Morehouse with a degree in sociology. So if anybody out there is a sociology major, you have the same degree as Dr. King. So he's 19 years old. He does decently at Morehouse College, but clearly people can see the promise in him. And so through the support of a mentor, he gets a letter of recommendation to attend Crozier Seminary School. He graduates valedictorian of Crozier and then receives a scholarship to attend a PhD program. So by the time he completes all of this, he's in his mid-20s, and clearly it's time for him to take on a pastorship. And so he decides to leave the protected embrace or overbearingness of his pop and decides to go to Montgomery. So he's in his mid-20s, and here he finds himself the pastor of a pretty prosperous church called Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So he's in town for about a year. There's other established leaders, E.D. Nixon, Abernathy are there. But in the case of the Montgomery bus boycott, that all spins under the persona of the mother of the movement, Miss Rosa Parks. And I think in a play of sort of old school sophistication, the old heads in the community said, well, this thing could work or it might not work. But we got this new guy in town, this King fella, that if this thing doesn't work, we could put it on his shoulders. But if it does work, we collectively could benefit from it. And so out of that meeting, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed and Dr. King was appointed the president. And as we know, some 300 plus days later, it goes to the Supreme Court. It passes and establishes precedent at a state level. And when I talk to young people, I like to use him as an example of being ready. Case in point, the evening after the initial day of the bus boycott, the people needed to galvanize, and so they all met at a church. And Dr. King was going to be the keynote, the culminating speaker. He had 1 hour. It took him 20 minutes to drive home and 20 minutes to drive back. So essentially he had 20 minutes to gather his thoughts, to allow him essentially to walk up to that podium without any particular script, but to deliver the right balance between sort of a militancy, love ethic rooted message that became the galvanizing speech that catapulted the people to sustain the boycott for as long as they did. He had 20 minutes. That means he didn't memorize it. It means he was successful because he was prepared. What you're doing in your educational foundation right now, we don't know the purpose just yet. But when your purpose comes, you got to dig into your mind. You got to dig into your prior knowledge to what you already know in order to address that situation. That's what happened to Dr. King, and literally history changed. I would say that Dr. King is a revolutionary in the spirit of the Christ figure being a revolutionary. If you read old scripture, Jesus was very much against poverty. He was very much against injustice. He was very much against power for power's sake. And you can see those same themes in Dr. King's work. His initially was talking about justice, treatment of human beings as citizens. The 1963 is really the culmination of that to put maximum pressure on legislation to address this issue. But he doesn't pass away. He's tragically assassinated April 4th, 1968, which is essentially 5 years later. And it's those 5 years where Dr. King falls out of favor with many people who were in consensus with him when he was fighting legal segregation or desegregation issues. He began to take on poverty. King began to take on America's record, its existence, its policy, particularly its foreign policy as it related to Vietnam and in even some cases China. And he began to use words like military power. And so he transcended his religiosity, he transcended his regional loyalty, he transcended his racial loyalty and took it into a human kind of experience. You know, Dr. King has been so promoted that he's almost entering into the lore of the untouchable. That I think in 100 years from now, he's going to be mystic. He'll almost be a saint-like figure. And he's deserving of it. But I like to let people know Dr. King was a human being. And it's important to know that our heroes are human beings, because if we sort of deify them, then we think their deeds are beyond our personal touch and the ability to role model or emulate. But no, Dr. King, and the appeal of him is that he was, a smack-talking, pool-shooting, cigar-sipping, cognac, whiskey drinking, whatever the case may be. He was complex and he had contradictions. And many of his sermons, I believe, were confession. You know, he was quick to make sure people did not deify him. He was quick to challenge people who wanted to judge. He talked regularly about his own shortcomings and his own sins. He was a man in his times called to a task that even he himself was fearful of and didn't think he could reach it. By no means is he just sort of this philosophical sleeping image on a pillow. Dr. King was a revolutionary in the streets in more ways than one.